Our first panelist is a good friend, and it's a very distinguished Cuban and Cuban-American historian and scholar, Juan Antonio Blanco. He is currently he's actually executive director for the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Initiatives at MDC, Miami-Dade College. He's a former Cuban scholar and diplomat, a former Cuban government official who has been in Miami, first went to Canada and then came to Miami, I think several years ago. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Juan Antonio Blanco.
Well, my friend Brian here made a lot of provocative questions, but something I learned a long time ago is don't let yourself be provoked by the CIA. So, so what I'm going to do is the following. I would like, instead of addressing those issues that he raised, which are very concrete, and I think that eventually we can engage in that kind of conversation later. I would like to, after all, I'm a historian, I have to pay for that. I would like to put this in a historic context in terms of where is Cuba today, where is the ruling elite, what are the ruling elite options, what seems to be the options that they are choosing at the present time, and if that is going to be changed at any time later, why could that eventually be changed? The first thing that I would like to say, which maybe it's obvious, but it's not bad to remember, is what is Cuba today? Cuba is simply a poor country, technologically backward, and located in the very margins of the new digital age and the globalization and knowledge economies. I listened very carefully to all the interesting data that was provided to us by our presentations in the morning. I would like to add to that a couple of things. One, in 2011, the internet connection speed in Cuba was less than 95 kbps, which is the second place, worst case after the Mayotte Islands in the world. So the speed of internet was the worst in the world after the Mayotte Islands. That's very important if you're thinking about where is Cuba in the modern economy? Where is Cuba in terms of moving ahead? As a historian, again, let me remind you a little interesting anecdote or data. Why did Cuba prosper so well in the 20th century? Even in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century? Because the rebellion of slaves in Haiti sparked fear in the Creole elite, in the Cuban Spanish at that time, Creole elite in Cuba, who owned the sugar mills and most of their agriculture. And they decided that the only way to avoid another rebellion in Cuba, which was at that point reflecting a demographic imbalance between the black population, the slave black population, and the white population, was to embrace the latest technology available that was coming out from Europe, from basically Great Britain, and introduce it in the sugar industry. So Cuba was one of the first countries in the hemisphere to have a modern economy. And it had a modern economy because there was this vision of embracing technology to avoid a rebellion. At this point, we are facing the opposite situation. We have an elite that fears technology because they fear rebellion. And the result of that is that Cuba is becoming every time more backward in terms of what is happening in the global economy and in the information economy. Another thing that just came out a couple days ago is that there is something called Institutional Quality Index. The report of 2014 of the Institutional Quality Index reports that Cuba's market institutions and political institutions are among the 5 worst in the hemisphere. Now, mind you, in the modern approach to, in the modern school of thinking about development, you know, there was a time that people thought that geographical factors were the decisive factors. In other times, there were other factors that were privileged to that. Well, currently, most sociologists and demographics and economists agree that the quality of institution is a decisive factor, if not the only one, for generating development. Well, if the institutional quality index of this year is right, Cuba ranks among the 5 worst situations in Latin America. So keep those two, and then a third one. If we're talking about a new digital age of information and knowledge economies, Cuba has another problem, and that is the flight of human capital. Yes, we have not seen another major one-shot, let's call it that way, exodus like Mariel or Camarioca or whatever. But at this point, almost 30,000 people are leaving the island every year. Most of them are young and professionals. So what we are seeing today is not only a country that lacks the necessary financial capital to reconstruct itself, as it was very well portrayed by our speakers in the morning, but also a country which, whenever decides to finally face the connection to the global economy in a competitive manner, would have a problem with this current flight of human capital. I'm terrible with technology. I talk about technology all the time, but I'm not very good at it. Now, I would like to make you reflect on this. The main ultimate goal for the Cuban elite, and I'm going to refer to what I believe is an elite, is to ensure the capacity to remain in power and to transfer it to their designated successors. This is something that was brought up by somebody in the audience, that they were thinking only about their own interest, which, after all, is natural. Everybody thinks after their own interest. Now, the main aspiration of most Cubans today is to live in a modern, prosperous, and open society. Make a note that I have avoided to put a label, an ideological or political label, capitalist, socialist, or whatever. They just want to live well. They want to have a future. They want to prosper. And they don't want to have a commissary, a political commissary, looking over their shoulder to see what they write, what they're watching, or who they're dealing with, or whatever. So they want a more transparent society. They want basically what we would call a democratic society with human rights. They don't define it in those terms, but in somehow what they want would require to have that type of society. Then I don't think that the first goal is compatible with the second, unless instead of updating the current regime, there is a regime change. Now, I want to talk about what I understand by regime change and what I understand by regime. By regime change, I'm not saying let's send the 82nd Airborne Division. That's not what I'm saying. And by regime, I'm not saying that we are talking about only a group of people or a particular group of a team of government, or even an autocratic type of regime. Regimes are, this is another type of definition which is very much used in social sciences, a set of particular institutions, values, normatives, norms that frame the type of society in which you live, that frames the limits and the possibilities within that particular society. So from the current regime, which obviously is totalitarian, you can still have a regime change to a still non-democratic type of regime or to a democratic regime. Now, from those three options, changing to a non-democratic regime, but with more market, with more economic rationale, like the one they have in China, in Russia, or in Vietnam, even if it's run by oligarchs or gangsters, they have not made that decision yet. They want to keep on basically where they are. And the other option, which will be to move to an open market, democratic regime, obviously has not been very much considered. So these are the three options: model through, non-democratic, and democratic transition. The interesting thing is that the model through option is not economic efficient to be self-sustainable. You need a major continuous injection of subsidies. So when Murillo says we need to get $2.5 billion a year to make this economy grow or whatever, what he's saying is to keep modeling through, we need this injection of capital. But once that capital is injected, frankly speaking, unless the regime changes into a market-oriented regime, is not going to make any basic difference. Now, each of those options goes with a different foreign policy. The first option would require a major injection of continuous subsidies. So to whom can you appeal in the current situation of the world? Venezuela, China, eventually some other country in the world, like Russia, that could provide that type of subsidy. If you're going for the second one, as was stated here, if you're going to move along the Chinese path, then you can go for the IFIs, you can go for the international financial institutions, you can eventually, make have a better relationship with Europe. I don't think that would be enough to move the American Congress into lifting the sanctions, but eventually you would have more options than with the first one. If you move to the third one, then you can enter into a period of normalizing relations with the big market, which would determine the possibility of the future economy in Cuba, which is obviously the United States. Now, what external events can be an incentive to either entrench or to move ahead? Well, my experience, and I think that any observer can come to the conclusion, that whenever they have had a major crisis, a major economic crisis, they have been opening up and making concessions to their own ideology and have been reforming or allowing certain spaces to the market, to intellectuals to have debates and so on. Once that they have found a new country that will provide the subsidies, like it happened in 2000 with Chavez, after 1998 with Chavez, they start to restrict again the spaces and to roll back the reforms that they made just to cope with the crisis in the moment, in the worst moment when all the Soviet Union was lost and everything else. So obviously, injecting more capital to the model through model, I don't think is going to move them into a different direction. It's going to help them to entrench, believing that they can get ahead. If Mr. Murillo can get the $2.5 billion for free, they are going to stay basically where they are. Now, losing those subsidies would require to eventually move into a different direction, meaning if the situation deteriorates with Venezuela, if Angola is not coming in as another source of subsidized oil, if the Chinese decide that they are pragmatic and they can help to a certain degree, but they want their money to be paid back to them, if the Russians don't go beyond asking for some military facilities to pressure Washington and the European Union every time that they have some crisis in Eastern Europe, then they would have to reconsider again and move ahead quicker than they're doing now. This is sin pausa pero sin prisa will become sin pausa and with prisa because things are deteriorating. What domestic force could pressure the elite to change path? Here, I am a fan of Barrington Moore Jr. Writings on and studies on rebellion and revolutions and all that. And his conclusion, basically after all his studies on rebellions and revolutions in different ages and different times in history, was that for people to rebel, there are three conditions that must coincide. One is that people must feel that their situation is unfair and intolerable. Second, people must believe, right or wrong, but they must believe that there is a way out that is believable and cost-effective. That maybe some sacrifices have to be done in the way, but that is an effective, viable, feasible, believable alternative to the conditions that they are in. The third one is a spark. an event that would eventually transform what have been bystanders into activists for change. So my question is, in terms of the opposition, of the dissident movement, of the exiled community, where do you think that we're standing in terms of those three conditions? In my opinion, a lot of attention have been paid to the first and third, very little to the second. Doesn't mean that different groups have not put forward different programs, different proposals, but they have not been persuasive enough for the bystanders who already believe that they are living in an unfair, intolerable situation to do something about it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. What are the odds? What are the odds that in the next, say, 2 or 3 years, that those three things could coincide?
The odds are always there because the second one have to do with creativity and with the capacity of the forces that would like to forge another path, the third option, to go around and rally the resources that are necessary to finance the transition. And I'm not saying subsidize the transition, I'm saying to finance the transition. But there must be a believable option there saying, let me give you an anecdote very quickly. When Clinton announced sometime in the 90s that if Cuba would take the path of reform, democratic reform, he estimated that almost immediately, $5 billion would come into the island in the form of aid or investment or whatever. The elite went crazy because they didn't know how they were going to respond to that, particularly at a moment that people were hungry, literally going hungry in the streets of Havana. So that's what transformed a bystander into an activist.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Antonio.